A freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm.
The SS Edmund Fitzgerald, which sank nearly 50 years ago, has been revisited by AI-powered deepwater drones. They've captured images experts say reveal details that were never made public until now.
Imagine the largest ship ever built to sail the Great Lakes. 729 feet of steel, powerful enough to haul 26,000 tons of iron ore in a single trip. Vanishing without a trace. No distress call, no flare, no survivors.
All 29 men on board died when that ship sank.
That's exactly what happened on the night of November 10th, 1975, when the SS Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared into Lake Superior. To this day, the silence of her final moments chills experts more than the storm itself. Captain Ernest McSorley's last words over the radio were steady and calm. We are holding our own. And then, nothing. Within minutes, the ship and all 29 men aboard were gone. Lake Superior is no stranger to shipwrecks. According to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, more than 350 vessels have been claimed by its icy waters, but none captured the public imagination like the Fitzgerald. She wasn't just a freighter. She was a legend. Nicknamed the pride of the American side, children along the shoreline grew up recognizing her silhouette, while tourists snapped photos of her passing under the Mackinac Bridge. And then, in a single storm, she became a ghost. The mystery has haunted investigators for nearly 50 years. Was it rogue waves towering 30 feet high? A catastrophic design failure? Or was the truth hidden in plain sight? A silent enemy gnawing away at the Fitzgerald long before her final voyage. For decades, families of the crew demanded answers. Historians debated theories. The Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board pointed fingers in different directions. And yet, despite countless dives and sonar scans, the Fitzgerald's final moments remained locked away in the black water. Until now. Because nearly 5 decades later, technology has returned to the depths of Lake Superior. Armed with AI-assisted drones, sonar mapping, and 4K cameras, researchers finally revealed details no one thought possible. What they discovered doesn't just rewrite the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It forces us to question how a ship once considered unsinkable could drown in silence. So stay with us. By the end of this journey, you'll see what the drones uncovered, and why those who studied the footage said it terrified them more than the storm itself. And if uncovering history's buried truths matters to you, press like and subscribe to Stone and Bone, so the voices of the past are never silenced again.
6,000 ships have been lost in the Great Lakes. Waters that never surrender their dead.
Long before her name became a synonym for disaster, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was a symbol of pride and power. When she launched in 1958 from the River Rouge shipyards of Michigan, she was the largest vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes, stretching 729 feet bow to stern, longer than 2 football fields placed end to end. Newspapers called her a floating skyscraper. To the shipping industry, she was a marvel. Her mission was straightforward: carry taconite iron ore from the mines near Duluth, Minnesota, to the steel mills of Detroit, Toledo, and beyond. But to the men who worked her decks, and to the families who saw her pass, she was something more. The Fitzgerald was sleek, striking, and strangely graceful for a ship of her size. Locals along the lake shores would gather just to watch her slide under the Mackinac Bridge, her horn echoing like a ghostly hymn. Tourists snapped photos. Children learned her name. And when Gordon Lightfoot immortalized her in song years later, she became not just a ship, but a legend. For the crew, she wasn't simply an employer. Sailors spoke of her with loyalty, almost affection. Letters home described life aboard the pride of the American side as a source of honor. Many crew members stayed with her voyage after voyage, choosing her over newer or smaller freighters. And at her helm was Captain Ernest McSorley, one of the most seasoned masters on the lakes. McSorley was known for his composure under pressure, a man who inspired calm even in rough seas. What few knew was that this would be his final season. He had quietly planned to retire after the year's end. The Fitzgerald was meant to be his last command before a life ashore. It's easy to forget that ships are more than steel and rivets. They carry human stories. Men with families waiting at home, birthdays, and Christmases they hope to return for. Among the Fitzgerald's 29 crew were fathers and sons, some veterans of decades on the lakes, others just starting their lives at sea. For them, the Fitzgerald was steady, dependable, almost untouchable. She had crossed the lakes more than 700 times without a fatal mishap. By the early 1970s, she had earned a reputation for strength, even unsinkable. But history rarely treats that word kindly. Titanic was called unsinkable. So was the Edmund Fitzgerald. The irony would not be lost on those who later examined her wreck, because what began as a ship celebrated for her grace and might would, less than 20 years later, lie silent in the dark and become the stage for one of the Great Lakes' greatest mysteries.
Morgan Clark asks how the Edmund Fitzgerald is faring. McSorley replies,
"We are holding our own."
These are the last words from the Edmund Fitzgerald.
On the evening of November 9th, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, carrying more than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets bound for Detroit. It was routine work, another long haul across the Great Lakes. Nothing about the start suggested it would end in tragedy. But November storms on Lake Superior are infamous. Mariners call them witches. Sudden tempests, with hurricane-force winds and waves taller than houses. That night, forecasts worsened as barometers dropped. Still, for seasoned crews, storms were part of the job. The Fitzgerald sailed in company with another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. The two ships stayed in radio contact, tracking each other's progress through snow squalls. By the morning of November 10th, the storm was monstrous. Winds above 70 miles per hour, waves climbing past 25 feet, sleet cutting across the decks, and visibility nearly gone. Even then, Captain McSorley remained calm. Around 3:30 p.m., he radioed the Anderson. "We are taking on water. We have a bad list. Lost event. One of the hatch covers is giving us trouble." His voice was steady, controlled, the mark of a man who had faced gales before. As darkness fell, the Andersons struggled to keep the Fitzgerald on radar. At 7:10 p.m., they received McSorley's last words. "We are holding our own." Minutes later, the Fitzgerald vanished. No mayday, no flare, no debris spotted. One of the largest, most admired ships on the Great Lakes had disappeared, as if swallowed whole. The Coast Guard was alerted at once. Search planes and helicopters swept the storm-tossed waters through the night, joined by other vessels. All they found were oil slicks and scattered debris. Not a single body was recovered. The youngest sailor was only 21 years old. Days later, the wreck was located 530 feet below the surface, split in two, the bow standing upright, the stern twisted nearby. Yet even this discovery offered no answers. How could a ship so respected collapse so suddenly, without time for a distress call? For mariners, it was a reminder that Superior's fury spared no one. For families, it was something worse, a silence that lingered for decades, with no goodbye to ease the loss. In the aftermath of the sinking, grief gave way to demands for answers. Families wanted closure. Mariners wanted reassurance. Investigators wanted explanations. But the official reports offered not clarity, but conflict. In 1977, the U.S. Coast Guard released its findings. The Fitzgerald's cargo hatches had failed, allowing waves to pour into the forward holds. With 26,000 tons of ore on board, even minor flooding could have tipped the ship past recovery. To the Coast Guard, it was preventable, a lapse in securing equipment. To the families, that verdict was unbearable, suggesting seasoned sailors under a respected captain had neglected something as basic as clamps felt like scapegoating. Captain McSorley's spotless record and the loyalty of his men made the theory sound like insult piled on grief. The National Transportation Safety Board countered with another possibility: sudden structural failure. Years of stress fractures, heavy loads, and fatigue might have cracked the Fitzgerald's spine, breaking her apart while still on the surface. Some experts pointed to uncharted shoals. Others blamed rogue waves, walls of water 30 feet high, known to swallow even the sturdiest freighters. Each theory carried weight. None explained the silence. Ships in trouble usually send a mayday or flare. The Fitzgerald gave only McSorley's calm final words: "We are holding our own." Minutes later, she was gone. Naval engineer John Orell later argued that stress fractures were likely in vessels of this design. Mariners, meanwhile, knew hatch clamp issues were widespread. But the truth lay 530 feet down, locked in steel that technology of the time couldn't properly examine. The result was frustration on all sides. Families rejecting blame, experts divided, and regulators left with theories rather than proof. The Fitzgerald's mystery didn't just survive the investigation. It grew. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was found just days after she vanished, split in two, resting 530 feet down in the cold, black water of Lake Superior. But finding her didn't mean understanding her. In fact, it only deepened the mystery. Technology in the mid-1970s was crude compared to today. Early dives used side-scan sonar and grainy submersible cameras. The images they produced were little more than blurred outlines, ghostly shapes of the bow and stern, distorted by sediment. Researchers could confirm where she lay, but not how she died. The gaps left by poor technology were quickly filled with imagination. Historians debated structural failure versus hatch cover collapse. Mariners argued over rogue waves and uncharted shoals. But outside those circles, myths grew larger than facts. Some whispered about sabotage. Others floated stories of supernatural curses. Lake Superior claiming what man called unsinkable. For the families, these theories were salt in an open wound. They didn't want legends. They wanted clarity. Without real evidence, speculation became the only currency, and it stretched on for decades. The 1980s and 90s brought more attempts to explore the wreck. Submersibles returned, this time with slightly better cameras. But the depth was still a challenge, and the equipment fragile. The footage captured was murky and incomplete. Bent railings, broken beams, little more. The crucial details: the condition of hatch clamps, vents, and structural joints remained shrouded in darkness. Even so, divers reported troubling hints: missing clamps, bent steel, torn vent membranes. Each detail seemed to point in a different direction, but none were sharp enough to draw conclusions. It was like looking at a crime scene through frosted glass. And so, the legend of the Edmund Fitzgerald lingered in uncertainty. She became more than a shipwreck. She was a cultural ghost, remembered in Gordon Lightfoot's haunting ballad, in museum exhibits, in the quiet grief of families who never had answers. But technology does not stand still, and nearly 50 years after she vanished, new eyes prepared to descend, sharper, colder, and more unforgiving than any before. The drones weren't going to capture outlines. They were going to perform an autopsy. Before dawn, nearly 5 decades after the Fitzgerald sank, a research vessel floated motionless above a GPS-locked point in Lake Superior. The water was deceptively calm, a glassy surface that gave no hint of the steel tomb lying 530 feet below. But on board, engineers and historians prepared for a mission that promised to do what no previous expedition could: to see the wreck in detail. With the clarity of modern eyes, the centerpiece of their work was a remotely operated vehicle, a drone unlike anything used in earlier dives. Outfitted with 6 high-powered floodlights, 4K resolution cameras, sonar arrays, and artificial intelligence scanning systems, it was designed not just to explore, but to document with surgical precision. Its thrusters were tuned for ultra-slow, quiet movement. Its manipulators could pick up objects no bigger than a coin. And most importantly, it could create detailed 3D models of everything it saw in real time. The descent began. Slowly, the tether unspooled, the lights cutting through layers of sediment stirred by currents. On screens inside the control room, murky outlines emerged from the darkness. First, vague shadows, then sharper edges. A hush fell over the team. And then, suddenly, she was there. The bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald loomed out of the gloom like a steel cathedral wall. Even through decades of rust and sediment, her form was unmistakable. Upright, massive, eerily still. Fish darted lazily across the camera's field of view, oblivious to the human drama frozen around them. The drone circled carefully, its lights grazing the jagged outlines of torn cargo hatches and battered deck plates. Moments later, the stern came into view. Inverted, twisted, lying apart from the bow, it bore scars of violent separation. Yet what shocked the team most wasn't the violence of the wreck. It was the calmness. There were no signs of an explosion, no fire, no obvious external collision. The Fitzgerald hadn't looked destroyed. She looked drowned. The ROV pushed closer, scanning millimeter by millimeter. Rivets, beams, hatch edges, paint scoured by decades underwater. The footage was sharper than anything seen before. Every scrape, every fracture, every missing piece of steel revealed itself in ghostly detail. And then came the first surprise. "Back her up 3 feet," one of the engineers instructed quietly. On the monitor, the lights shifted to reveal the edge of a cargo hatch. A clamp was gone. Not corroded, not bent. Gone. These clamps weren't minor details. Each hatch had 22 of them, designed to lock down the covers against even the most furious waves. Without them, the barrier between the storm and 26,000 tons of iron ore collapsed. And this was just the beginning of what the drones would find. The drone's cameras swept across the Fitzgerald's forward deck, and what they captured was not just haunting, it was damning. What began as an expedition to map a wreck had transformed into something closer to a forensic autopsy. The first missing clamp spotted startled the team, but as the ROV moved to the second and third hatches, a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Clamp after clamp was bent, missing, or violently torn away. These weren't isolated flaws. This was widespread failure. One engineer whispered what everyone in the control room already knew. This ship was taking water the moment she hit those waves. Each of the Fitzgerald's 21 hatch covers had been secured by 22 steel clamps, 462 in total. Together, they were the ship's only shield against the fury of Lake Superior. But here, in the drone's unflinching footage, those shields were shattered. Some clamps looked twisted backward, as if wrenched by repeated blows of water. Others were gone entirely, leaving gaping seams where freezing waves could hammer straight into the cargo hold. And then came the most chilling find of all. The drone's floodlights swept across a section of the deck where a vent pipe should have stood. Instead, there was only a sheared-off opening, a 4-inch hole leading directly into the ship's forward hold. One of the researchers spoke quietly, almost to himself. That's a straight funnel into the lungs of the ship. Through that single opening, simulation suggested, thousands of gallons of water could have poured in every minute. Combined with compromised hatches, the Fitzgerald may have been flooding at a rate of over 4,000 gallons per minute. At that speed, even a Leviathan of 729 feet wouldn't have stood a chance. Within half an hour, she would become fatally unstable. The discovery reframed Captain McSorley's final words when he radioed the Anderson with the calm assurance, "We are holding our own." He likely believed the ship was battered but secure. What he couldn't know was that beneath his feet, an unstoppable flood was spreading silently through the oar holds. The footage revealed more than missing clamps and torn vents. Sediment trails could be seen running inside the coamings of the hatches. Fine streaks of sand and silt etched into the steel, showing the direction and persistence of water flow before the ship finally succumbed. To forensic engineers, it was unmistakable evidence. Water had been breaching those hatches for hours. Even more unsettling were the repairs visible on certain clamps. Some weren't original. They appeared to be retrofits. Replacements made during the Fitzgerald's 17 years of service. That raised a darker possibility. The ship had a known history of stressed hatch hardware. Crews may have spotted the weaknesses, patched them, and moved on. If true, the Fitzgerald wasn't blindsided by a storm. She was already weakened long before her final voyage. One maritime architect who reviewed the footage put it bluntly. This wasn't a ship breaking apart. This was a ship slowly drowning. And that realization shook the experts more than any rogue wave or shoal theory. The Fitzgerald had not failed dramatically, but quietly. She had been undone by her own vulnerabilities, design limitations, decades of wear, and the merciless pounding of Superior's November gales. For the families, the drone footage carried a bittersweet truth. It shifted the blame away from human error. The crew hadn't failed to secure their ship. They hadn't made reckless mistakes. Instead, they had fought bravely on a vessel already compromised by flaws invisible in the storm. McSorley's calm voice wasn't denial. It was trust in a ship that was already betraying him. The implications stretched beyond one tragedy. The Fitzgerald wasn't unique in her design. Dozens of other freighters of her era used the same clamp systems, the same vent structures, the same unsinkable assumptions. The Fitzgerald's wreck had become not just a grave, but a blueprint of how quietly and fatally ships of her generation could fail. For the team watching the drone feed, silence hung heavy in the control room. They weren't just looking at twisted steel. They were staring at the last moments of 29 men who never knew they were drowning until it was too late. For all the technical details the drones revealed, the heart of the Edmund Fitzgerald tragedy was never just steel and rivets. It was the men who went down with her. Fathers, sons, brothers, friends. 29 lives ended in silence that November night, and for decades their families lived with an ache sharpened by uncertainty. Some of the sailors were veterans of the lakes, men who had weathered storms for years and trusted the Fitzgerald as much as they trusted themselves. Others were just beginning their careers. The youngest, George Hall, was only 21. He had written home days earlier about looking forward to Thanksgiving. He never made it. Captain Ernest McSorley's story carried its own haunting weight. A seasoned mariner in his 60s, McSorley had spent a lifetime on the water. Calm under pressure, admired by his peers, he had privately told friends he planned to retire after the season. The Fitzgerald was supposed to be his final command, his farewell to the storms of the Great Lakes. Instead, it became his grave. For the families, the lack of a distress call was devastating. No last words. No goodbyes. Widows and children gathered in churches and community halls, listening to the Coast Guard's reports, desperate for answers that never came. Each theory, rogue waves, shoals, faulty hatches, felt less like closure and more like speculation laid over grief. That's why the drone footage hit so hard when it emerged decades later. For the first time, families saw evidence that exonerated their loved ones. The crew had not been careless. They hadn't failed to secure hatches or ignored procedures. They were simply caught aboard a vessel whose design and maintenance gave them no chance. One widow, interviewed years after the findings, said quietly, "At least now, I know my husband did everything he could. He wasn't to blame. None of them were." the discovery reframed McSorley's final words too. "We are holding our own," was not an act of denial. It was an honest assessment from a captain who believed his ship was still with him, unaware that the storm was pouring death into the holds beneath his feet. In that light, the silence of the Fitzgerald's crew became even more tragic. They weren't defeated men. They were sailors doing their duty, confident that they would make it home. By the time the water overcame them, there was no time to cry out. The families never recovered bodies. No coffins were buried. Their only memorial was the ship itself, resting in two pieces on the lakebed. For many, Gordon Lightfoot's ballad became their hymn of mourning, echoing the loss in lines that carried their grief to every radio and stage. The Fitzgerald was not just a shipwreck. It was an unfinished story for the people left behind. And when the drones finally revealed the truth, it offered something rare in maritime tragedies, a measure of absolution. The drone footage didn't just solve a mystery. It exposed a blueprint of vulnerability that shook the maritime world. What sank the Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't just one storm. It was a convergence of design limits, decades of wear, and assumptions that went unquestioned until it was too late. To the untrained eye, a missing clamp or a torn vent pipe might seem like minor damage. But naval architects saw something far more dangerous: systemic weakness. Each of the Fitzgerald's 21 hatches relied on 22 clamps, for a total of 462. They weren't backed by secondary seals, no failsafes, no double hull barriers like modern vessels use. Her survival depended entirely on every single clamp working perfectly. In calm weather, that design was sufficient. In 30-foot seas, with waves slamming down like wrecking balls, it was wishful thinking. This revelation forced experts to re-examine an uncomfortable truth. The Fitzgerald was not alone. Many freighters of her era shared similar designs. That meant the silent failure that doomed her could just as easily have claimed other ships. For decades, Great Lakes freighters hauled nearly 100 million tons of ore, coal, and grain each year. Thousands of sailors placed their trust in ships built on the same fragile assumptions. The Coast Guard's 1977 report, once criticized for speculating about hatch failure, suddenly seemed prophetic. But the drone evidence did more than vindicate their theory. It reframed it. The failure wasn't human error, as families had feared. It was engineering vulnerability. And that distinction mattered. It meant the men had done their jobs. But the system they trusted had failed them. Maritime safety boards began to weigh the implications. If clamps and hatches could corrode or tear loose under stress, then the same weaknesses might still be lurking in ships used for limited freight runs, or preserved as museum vessels. Some experts even called for inspections of retired freighters, arguing that silent structural failures could be present in vessels still afloat today. Comparisons to modern safety systems made the contrast sharper. Today, cargo vessels use flood detection sensors that alert crews the moment water enters a hold. Double hull construction creates redundancy, so one breach doesn't spell disaster. Hatch covers are reinforced with multiple layers of protection, not just clamps. In many ways, the Fitzgerald was a giant of her time. But her defenses were outdated, even as she set sail in 1975. The implications went beyond technology. Regulators had signed off on these designs for years. Inspections had passed without forcing upgrades. The very system designed to safeguard sailors had allowed ships like the Fitzgerald to sail with vulnerabilities hidden in plain sight. It wasn't just a shipwreck anymore. It was an indictment of complacency. One maritime historian put it bluntly: the Fitzgerald didn't just sink. She exposed the blind spots of an entire industry. For sailors who survived the storm on other vessels, the findings were sobering. Many realized that fate, not design, had spared them. If the clamps on the Anderson or other freighters had failed, their names might have been memorialized alongside the Fitzgerald's crew. The Fitzgerald's loss, once wrapped in myth and speculation, had become a warning carved in steel. It was a reminder that engineering shortcuts, unchecked wear, and blind faith in unsinkable designs could turn even the mightiest ship into a coffin. Nearly 50 years on, the Edmund Fitzgerald is more than a shipwreck. She is a cultural ghost, a cautionary tale, and for many, a personal wound that never fully healed. The drone footage may have stripped away myths, but it also transformed the tragedy into something larger, a message about human limits in the face of nature. And our responsibility not to repeat the same mistakes. For the families, the discoveries offered something close to absolution. The evidence confirmed what they had always believed, that their loved ones were not at fault. The clamps and torn vents told the story of a vessel undone by its own vulnerabilities, not by the neglect of the men who sailed her. Captain McSorley's final words, "We are holding our own," were no longer seen as misplaced confidence, but as the honest voice of a captain fighting bravely to the end, unaware that water was pouring in beneath his boots. For the maritime world, the Fitzgerald became a case study. Her story pushed safety standards forward, highlighting the need for redundant systems, stronger hatch designs, and real-time monitoring of structural integrity. Every freighter that sails today, with sensors, alarms, and double hulls, carries echoes of the Fitzgerald's silent lessons. But the legacy is not only technical, it is also cultural. Gordon Lightfoot's haunting ballad, "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," ensured the ship and her crew would never be forgotten. Museums on the Great Lakes preserve her story, drawing visitors who stand in front of scale models and salvaged artifacts, reflecting on how quickly life can be claimed by the water. Each November, memorial services are held, bells tolled 29 times to honor each life lost. The ship's resting place, now protected, remains untouched. A graveyard and a monument in one. The mystery once made the Fitzgerald legendary. The truth makes her human. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy. That behind the rivets and beams were real men who trusted their ship, their captain, and their luck against Superior's fury. Today, when storms sweep across the Great Lakes, sailors still speak her name. The Fitzgerald is no longer just a cautionary tale of November gales. She is a reminder that legends can sink, silence can kill, and the line between confidence and catastrophe can be crossed in minutes. The message she leaves is stark, but vital. Respect the water, respect the limits of design, and never confuse unsinkable with safe. Beneath 530 feet of black water, the Edmund Fitzgerald still lies in silence. Her bow stands upright like a steel tombstone, her stern twisted nearby, a frozen reminder of how quickly strength can become fragility. For decades, her story was myth and speculation. Today, thanks to technology, it is truth. The Fitzgerald didn't explode. She didn't vanish into legend. She drowned quietly, undone by missing clamps, torn vents, and design limits that gave her crew no chance. Yet her legacy endures. The lessons drawn from her wreck reshaped safety standards. Her memory is kept alive in song, in museums, and in the families who still mourn. And every November, when the gales return to Superior, sailors whisper her name as a reminder. No ship is truly unsinkable. The Fitzgerald's final secret may not have been mystery after all, but message. A warning from the depths that silence can be more dangerous than storm. If this journey moved you, if you believe the 29 men of the Fitzgerald deserve to be remembered, press like so their story is not drowned out again. And subscribe to Stone and Bone, because the next secret waiting in history's shadows may change the way we see the past forever.